Life usually slips away in silence, but in Trauma Room 4, it was screaming. Zarya's world was reduced to the slick heat of blood on her gloves and the frantic, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor flatlining into a steady, terrifying drone. She didn't see the dozen men in tailored suits locking down the hospital corridor, she only saw the man on the table, shattered, bleeding, and fading. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, Zarya plunged her hands into his chest, literally pulling his heart back into rhythm. When his dark, intense eyes finally snapped open, they didn't hold the glazed look of a survivor, they held the sharp, predatory focus of a king. Before she could pull away, his hand clamped around her wrist like a shackle, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated through her bones. I died today, which means from this moment on, your life belongs to me. The air in the trauma unit was thick with the scent of copper and antiseptic. Zarya stumbled back, her teal scrub stained a dark, heavy crimson as the heart monitor finally surged back to life with a triumphant pulse. You're stable, she exhaled, her voice shaking as she wiped sweat from her brow. You're going to make it. The man, known to the world as Ha-Jin Kwan, didn't look at the monitors or the trembling surgical residents. His gaze was fixed entirely on Zarya, tracking the rise and fall of her chest with a chilling, silent intensity. He didn't look like a patient, he looked like a predator assessing a rare find. What is your name? He demanded. It wasn't a request, it was a command that seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. Zarya, she whispered, her moral compass overriding her fear. I'm your nurse. You need to rest, Mr. Doe. A ghost of a smile touched his blood-flecked lips as he watched her. Outside the glass doors, the hospital staff stood frozen, paralyzed by the wall of silent, armed men in black suits who had turned the ER into a fortress. I am no one's Doe, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate level as he tightened his grip on her hand. And you are no longer just a nurse. You are the only person in this city allowed to touch me. Zarya tried to pull back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. I was just doing my job. You don't owe me anything, just let me go back to my patients. Ha-Jin tilted his head, a dark, possessive curiosity flickering in his eyes as he looked at the blood she had spilled to save him. You saved a war, Zarya. My enemies will kill you for your kindness, and my friends will worship you for your skill. He leaned closer, his shadow swallowing her whole. Either way, the world you knew ended the second my heart beat for you. There is nowhere left for you to hide. As the realization of who she had saved began to dawn on her, Zarya looked at the red handprint on her wrist. She hadn't just saved a life, she had become the most hunted woman in the city, bound to a man who viewed her mercy as his new favorite weapon. The transition happened in less than an hour. The chaotic, overflowing emergency ward Zarya called home was gone, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence that felt heavier than the screams of the dying. The entire fourth floor had been cleared. No monitors chirped from neighboring rooms, no families wept in the waiting area. There was only the sound of Zarya's own rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the linoleum and the rhythmic thud of black Oxfords trailing 2 steps behind her. At the entrance to the intensive care wing, 2 men stood like granite pillars. They didn't wear hospital security badges, they wore earpieces and the unmistakable bulge of holstered iron beneath their charcoal jackets. As Zarya approached, one of them stepped into her path, his hand resting casually but firmly on the hilt of his weapon. I have other patients, Zarya said, her voice steadier than she felt. She clutched her clipboard to her chest like a shield. I have a woman in 302 with a pulmonary embolism and a kid in. You have one patient, the man interrupted, his voice as cold as the sterile air. He didn't look at her face, he looked at the ID badge clipped to her teal scrubs. Mr. Kwan does not like to wait. He didn't invite her in, he steered her. The heavy double doors clicked shut behind them, a sound that resonated like a tomb ceiling. The hallway was lined with Ha-Jin's soldiers, their eyes tracking her every movement with a disturbing, predatory hunger. She was no longer a professional in a place of healing, she was a captive in a war room. When she entered the private suite, the scent of expensive cologne fought against the sharp tang of iodine. Ha-Jin was propped up against the pillows, his chest bandaged where she had carved into him just hours before. The hospital gown looked absurd on him, yet he wore it with the same commanding authority as a suit. Beside him stood a man with a jagged scar across his cheek, holding a small, silver-plated handgun focused directly on Zarya's heart. "Lower the weapon, Daeho," Ha-Jin rasped. His voice was a jagged blade, weakened by surgery but still sharp enough to draw blood. "Boss, she's a civilian. We can't risk." "I said lower it." Ha-Jin's dark eyes never left Zarya's. The man obeyed, but the threat remained, vibrating in the air. Ha-Jin beckoned her closer with a slow, deliberate movement of his hand. As Zarya reached the bedside to check his vitals, her fingers trembling as she reached for his pulse point, he caught her hand again. His skin was burning with fever, but his grip was absolute. "They want to move me to a private facility," Ha-Jin whispered, leaning in until she could see the flecks of gold in his obsidian eyes. "But I think I'll stay." "You have steady hands, Zarya. I want to see if they stay that way when the world starts to burn." The fever broke at dawn, leaving Ha-Jin's face pale but his presence more terrifyingly alert than before. When Zarya entered the room to change his dressings, she expected to find him sedated by the heavy narcotics flowing through his fore. Instead, he was sitting upright, watching the door with the stillness of a gargoyle. The guards in the corner stiffened, their hands hovering near their waistbands, but Ha-Jin dismissed them with a single, infinitesimal jerk of his chin. Zarya didn't wait for permission. She moved into his personal space, the scent of antiseptic and her own citrus-scented soap filling the gap between them. She reached for the bandage on his shoulder, her touch clinical and firm. "Most people start shaking when they realize who I am," Ha-Jin said, his voice a low, melodic vibration. He studied the way her hands moved, efficient, steady, and utterly unimpressed by the men standing watch outside. "You didn't even flinch when Daeho leveled a gun at your chest. Why?" Zarya peeled back the gauze, her brown eyes meeting his intense, dark gaze without blinking. "I've seen a 12-year-old die of a stray bullet in my trauma bay, Mr. Kwan. I've held the hands of mothers who lost everything in a single night. Your men and their guns are just more noise in a city that's already too loud." A dry, raspy sound escaped his throat, a chuckle that clearly pained his stitched-up torso. "A saint with a spine of steel," he murmured. He reached out with his uninjured arm, plucking a gold-embossed fountain pen and a slip of heavy vellum from the bedside table. He scribbled something quickly and thrust it toward her. "The life you gave back to me is worth more than this entire hospital. Consider this a blank check. Houses, jewelry, tuition, the safety of your family. Name the price for your miracle." Zarya looked at the paper, then back at the man who thought everything in the world bore a price tag. She didn't take the check. Instead, she adjusted the flow of his foredrip, her expression softening with a pity that seemed to irritate him. "I don't want your money, Ha-Jin," she said, using his name for the first time. The guards shifted uncomfortably at the breach of protocol. "If you truly feel you owe me a debt, then use the life I saved to do something besides ending others. Stop the violence. Let this city breathe for a day." For a moment, the room went deathly silent. Ha-Jin stared at her, the dark curiosity in his eyes blooming into something more complex, something that looked dangerously like fascination. Then, he threw his head back and laughed. The sound was harsh and genuine, though it turned into a wince of pain as his wounds pulled. "You saved a wolf, Zarya," he gasped, his eyes shining with a dark, predatory light. "And now you're asking him to become a lamb. I can't stop the war, little nurse. But I can make sure you're the only thing that survives it." The silence of the fourth floor didn't break, it shattered. It started with the muffled thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire echoing from the elevator bank, followed by the heavy, sickening thud of Ha-Jin's outer guards hitting the floor. Zarya froze, her hand hovering over a tray of sterile instruments, as the soft chime of the emergency alert was cut short by a burst of static. "They're here," Hajin rasped. He was already struggling to swing his legs over the side of the bed, his face ashen, the white of his bandages beginning to bloom with fresh, angry crimson. "You can't walk, you'll rupture the internal sutures," Zarya hissed, rushing to his side. "If I stay in this bed, I'm a sitting duck." He reached for the handgun on the nightstand, but his fingers cramped, the tremors of post-surgical shock betraying him. The sound of heavy boots sprinted down the hallway. Shouts in Korean erupted, followed by the splintering of wood. There was no time for the service stairs, and the elevators were death traps. Zarya's mind raced through the hospital's blueprints, the geography of healing now a map for survival. She grabbed the handle of Hajin's mobile bed, kicked off the locks, and began to push with a strength born of pure desperation. "Where are you taking me?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper as he gripped the railing. "Somewhere they won't look for the living," she replied, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She swerved the bed into the freight elevator, hitting the button for the basement. As the doors slid shut, a bullet sparked off the metal frame, missing her shoulder by inches. The descent felt like an eternity. When the doors opened, the air turned frigid, smelling of formaldehyde and finality. She pushed him through the swinging double doors of the morgue. The room was lined with stainless steel drawers, a silent city of the dead. Hajin watched her, his dark eyes tracking her every move as she hauled him off the bed and toward an oversized, empty cooling unit. "In here. Now," she commanded. He hesitated, a flash of grim irony crossing his face. "You're putting me in a grave, Zarya." "I'm keeping you out of one," she snapped, helping him slide onto the cold metal tray. She climbed in beside him, pulling the heavy doors shut until only a sliver of light remained. In the cramped, freezing darkness, the space was so tight their heartbeats seemed to merge. Zarya could feel the heat radiating from his feverish skin and the steady, rhythmic pulse she had fought so hard to restore. Above them, the morgue doors kicked open. Muffled voices argued in the hallway, the metallic clack of weapons echoing against the tiled walls. Zarya held her breath, her hand instinctively finding Hajin's. He didn't pull away. Instead, he laced his fingers through hers, his grip bruisingly tight. For several agonizing minutes, death paced just outside their steel cocoon. Then, the footsteps faded. As the silence returned, Hajin turned his head in the dark, his lips brushing her temple. "You had every chance to walk away, Zarya," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. "Why stay?" "Because I'm your nurse," she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "And I don't lose patience." The chaos of the hit had been scrubbed away with the same clinical efficiency Hajin applied to everything else. Within 48 hours, the bullet holes in the trauma unit were plastered over, the blood was bleached from the floors, and the bodies of the cleaning crew had vanished as if they had never existed. But the hospital felt different. The air was charged with a heavy, expectant electricity that centered entirely on the man sitting in the leather chair of the administrator's office. Zarya stood across from Hajin, her navy scrubs freshly pressed, though the dark circles under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit that cost more than her 4-year degree, the sharp lines of the tailoring concealing the bandages that still bound his torso. He looked every bit the sovereign king, his recovery a testament to his sheer, stubborn will. "You're being discharged, Mr. Kwan," Zarya said, placing his final charts on the desk. "The internal bleeding has stopped, and your vitals are stable. You're free to go." "I am," Hajin agreed, his voice a low, resonant hum. He didn't stand up. Instead, he slid a thick, mahogany-colored folder across the desk. "And so is this hospital. I've just authorized a $50 million endowment. A new oncology wing, state-of-the-art trauma suites, and a salary increase for every nurse on the payroll." Zarya's breath hitched. That's more than this neighborhood has seen in 50 years. Why? Because every gift has a string, Zarya, he said, standing slowly. He walked toward her, the predatory grace returning to his stride even as he moved with a slight, measured caution. He stopped inches from her, his presence a wall of heat and expensive spice. The board of directors has accepted the donation. They've also accepted the condition attached to it. A cold finger of dread traced Zarya's spine. What condition? The Monroe Wing requires a dedicated director of medical consulting, Hajin said, his eyes locking onto hers with a dark, possessive intensity. A role that requires you to be on call for my personal medical needs, exclusively. You will have your wing, your funding, and your career. But you will have them under my protection. You're buying me, Zarya whispered, her chest tightening. You're turning my hospital into a cage. Hajin reached out, his thumb grazing the pulse point at her throat, which was thrumming like a trapped bird. I am ensuring the survival of the only person who hasn't tried to take something from me. You saved my life, Zarya. Now, I am claiming yours. You can stay here and watch this hospital rot under city budget cuts, or you can come with me and save anyone you want, as long as you save me first. He didn't wait for her to argue. He turned toward the door, where his men were already waiting to escort her to the black sedan idling at the curb. He had built her a throne out of gold and medicine, and for the first time, Zarya realized that his gratitude was far more dangerous than his wrath. The car climbed the winding private road like a silent shadow, finally pulling to a stop before a monolith of steel and glass perched high above the city's glowing arteries. This was Hajin's fortress, a masterpiece of minimalist isolation. As Zarya stepped out, the cool mountain air bit at her skin, a sharp contrast to the humid, overtaxed hallways of the hospital. Inside, the penthouse was a cathedral of silence. There were no crying patients, no sirens, and no life, only vast, echoing spaces of polished marble and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked down on the world as if it were a game board. Your quarters are in the East Wing, Hajin said, his voice sounding thinner in the massive room. He had discarded his suit jacket, and his white shirt was partially unbuttoned, revealing the edge of the bandages Zarya had applied. He looked smaller here, framed against the infinite black of the night sky. As she followed him to his private study to perform his evening checkup, Zarya stopped. The room was lined with ancient books and a single, low-lit desk covered in maps and ledgers, but what caught her eye was a small, dusty piano in the corner. It sat untouched, a ghost of a different life. Beside it was a single photograph, yellowed at the edges, a young Hajin standing with a woman whose smile was the only warm thing in the room. My mother, Hajin said, noticing her gaze. His expression didn't soften, it hardened, as if the memory were a physical weight. She thought she could keep me away from the family business. She died realizing she was wrong. Zarya approached him, her medical bag heavy in her hand. You're the head of a syndicate, Hajin. You have thousands of men ready to die for you. Why does it feel like there's no one in this house? Because loyalty in my world is bought, and trust is a death sentence, he replied, sitting heavily in a leather chair. He winced, his hand instinctively clutching his side. Every man out there wants my seat. Every woman wants my name for the power it carries. You are the only person who has touched me without wanting to take a piece of me. As Zarya knelt to check the drainage of his wound, she looked up and saw the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. The monster the city whispered about was bleeding, not just from the bullet holes, but from the crushing gravity of a crown he could never take off. For a fleeting second, the predatory light in his eyes flickered out, replaced by a hollow, aching loneliness that no amount of gold could fill. It's a heavy burden, she whispered, her fingers light against his skin. It's a cage, Zarya, he rasped, his hand reaching out to tentatively touch a stray lock of her hair. And now, I've pulled you into it with me. The notification on Zarya's phone chimed at 3 in the morning, a digital heartbeat in the oppressive silence of the penthouse. She squinted at the screen, expecting a hospital alert or a news update. Instead, she saw a string of zeros that made her blood run cold. $2 million had been wired into her personal savings account from an offshore entity. It was more money than she would have earned in 3 lifetimes of double shifts and overtime. To anyone else, it was a winning lottery ticket. To Zarya, it looked like a stain. She found Ha-Jin in the glass-walled gym, despite her strict orders for bed rest. He was dressed in black sweatpants, his bare torso glistening with a light sweat that made his bandages look dangerously translucent. He was staring at a heavy punching bag, not hitting it, but looking at it as if it were an enemy he hadn't yet decided how to kill. "Take it back," Zarya said, her voice echoing off the glass. She held the phone out like a weapon. Ha-Jin didn't turn around. "It's a down payment. Consider it hazard pay for the morgue." "I am a nurse, not a mercenary," she snapped, stepping into his line of sight. Her chest heaved with a mix of fury and fear. "I don't take blood money, Ha-Jin. I saved you because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted to be on your payroll. You're trying to buy my conscience so you don't have to feel guilty about the lives you ruin." Ha-Jin finally looked at her, and the intensity in his dark eyes was suffocating. He moved toward her, his pace slow and deliberate, until he was close enough that she could smell the salt and the faint metallic tang of his healing wounds. "You think this is about guilt?" He laughed, a low, humorless sound that vibrated in the small space. "I don't feel guilt, Zarya. I feel reality. That money isn't a bribe, it's a valuation. In my world, everything has a price. My life was worth a certain amount of blood, and yours is now worth the target on your back. My life isn't for sale," she shouted. "It already was the moment you put your hands inside my chest." Ha-Jin roared, stepping into her space, his shadow looming over her. "That money is for your family. For a plane if you need to run. For a life that doesn't involve scrubbing floors in a war zone. Do you have any idea what my rivals would pay to find a weakness in me? You are that weakness now." He grabbed her hand, forcing her to look at the screen. "You want to return it? Fine. Give it back to the void. But don't pretend that being broke makes you safe. I am trying to give you a fighting chance in a world that will kill you just to spite me." Zarya looked at his hand, scarred, powerful, and desperate, clutched around hers. She realized then that the money wasn't a gift or a cage, it was a confession. He was terrified that he had already cost her everything. The silk of the midnight blue gown felt like a second skin, cold and dangerously thin. Zarya stared at her reflection, hardly recognizing the woman in the mirror. The teal scrubs were gone, replaced by diamonds that felt like ice against her throat and a dress that cost more than the annual budget of her emergency room. Ha-Jin stood behind her, adjusting the high collar of his tuxedo. His reflection was sharp, lethal, and devastatingly handsome, but his eyes remained those of a man watching for an ambush. "I don't belong here," Zarya whispered, her fingers nervously tracing the expensive fabric. "This isn't a gala, Ha-Jin. It's a showroom." "It's a declaration," he corrected, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rasp. He placed a hand on the small of her back, his touch a claim that sent a shiver through her. "They think I am weak because I bled. I am going to show them I am stronger because I survived. And you are the proof." The ballroom of the Grand Excelsior was a sea of shimmering predators. Men with cold smiles and women with eyes like polished flint turned as they entered. The music seemed to skip a beat, the air thickening with a sudden, suffocating tension. This wasn't the high society Zarya had seen in movies, this was a gathering of wolves in sheep's clothing, and she was the only lamb in the room. Ha-Jin led her through the crowd, his grip on her arm unyielding. He introduced her to men whose names were whispered in police precincts and back alleys, heads of rival families and corrupt politicians. Each time he spoke, his message was the same: "This is the woman who brought me back. This is my miracle." He wasn't protecting her, he was parading her. You're making them hate me, Zarya hissed under her breath as they paused near a balcony. She felt 100 eyes boring into her, measuring her worth, looking for the chink in Hajin's armor. You're painting a bullseye on my back. I am showing them what is mine, Hajin replied, his gaze scanning the room with clinical precision. He leaned in closer, his breath warm against her ear. In this world, Zarya, if you don't claim something, it is taken. By the end of tonight, everyone will know that to touch you is to declare war on me. Across the room, a man with silvered hair and a jagged scar across his brow, a leader of the Iron Fang, raised a glass toward them. His smile didn't reach his eyes, which were fixed on Zarya with a terrifying, hungry curiosity. In that moment, the glamour of the diamonds vanished. Zarya realized that she wasn't Hajin's guest, she was his most valuable asset, the living trophy of his survival. He had brought her into the light not to honor her, but to dare his enemies to try and take her. The hospital felt like a sanctuary until the moment the air turned cold. Despite Hajin's endowment and the high-tech security, Zarya had insisted on returning for a double shift. She needed the rhythm of the ward to remind her that she was still a healer, not just a trophy in a glass penthouse. The trauma bay was quiet, the 3 a.m. lull settling over the floor, when a man in a white lab coat approached the central station. He kept his head down, the mask obscuring his face, but it was the way he moved, not with the tired slouch of a resident, but with the coiled tension of a spring, that made the hair on Zarya's neck stand up. Nurse Monroe. I have the pathology results for the patient in 412, he muttered, his voice muffled. As Zarya reached for the folder, the fluorescent lights caught the flash of steel. It wasn't a knife, but a surgical scalpel, its edge coated in a faint, oily sheen. He lunged, the blade sweeping toward her throat with professional precision. Zarya's athletic instincts kicked in, she threw herself backward, her hip catching the edge of the desk, as the blade sliced through the shoulder of her teal scrubs, grazing her skin. She didn't even have time to scream before the double doors of the unit exploded inward. Hajin didn't arrive like a man, he arrived like a force of nature. He had been monitoring her through the hidden cameras his team had installed, and the violence he unleashed was instantaneous. He caught the assassin's wrist mid-swing, the sound of snapping bone echoing through the sterile hallway like a dry branch breaking. Hajin, stop! Zarya cried, clutching her shoulder, the sting of the scratch beginning to burn. But the man she had saved, the one she had seen vulnerable and lonely in his penthouse, was gone. In his place was the monster. Hajin slammed the assassin onto the stainless steel charting table, his fingers sinking into the man's throat. There was no hesitation, no mercy. He didn't use a gun, he used his bare hands, his face a mask of cold, concentrated rage. Who sent you? Hajin's voice was a low, demonic growl. The assassin gasped, struggling for air, but Hajin leaned down, whispering something into the man's ear that made his eyes go wide with pure, unadulterated terror. With a sickening thud, Hajin drove the assassin's own poisoned blade into the man's thigh, twisting it until the screams filled the ER. Zarya watched, frozen, as Hajin's men swarmed the room to drag the bleeding man away. Hajin turned to her, his knuckles barked and his shirt stained with the assassin's blood. He reached out to touch her face, his hands still trembling with the adrenaline of the kill. You're hurt, he rasped, his eyes searching hers for a spark of the woman who had saved him. You were going to kill him, Zarya whispered, recoiling from his touch. In my hospital. In a place where I save people. He came to take my heart out of its chest again, Hajin said, his voice hardening as he realized she was looking at him with fear. I will burn this city to the ground before I let anyone touch you. In that moment, Zarya realized the terrifying truth, the man she saved was a protector, but his protection was a massacre. The call came at midnight, not through a hospital pager, but through the heavy, vibrating thrum of a black SUV idling outside Zarya's window. Within 20 minutes, she was being hurried through the service entrance of an unmarked warehouse, far from the sterile safety of the Monroe wing. The air here was damp and smelled of oil, old concrete, and the unmistakable, iron-heavy scent of fresh trauma. "He won't make it to the hospital," Ha-Jin said, his voice emerging from the shadows. He looked weary, his coat discarded, his white sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms flecked with someone else's blood. He gestured toward a makeshift surgical table illuminated by harsh, swinging construction lamps. Lying on the table was Dae-ho, the lieutenant who had once held a gun to Zarya's heart. Now, he was the one fading. His abdominal cavity had been torn open by shrapnel, and the makeshift bandages were already soaked through. A group of hardened men stood in the periphery, their hands on their weapons, their eyes fixed on Zarya with a mixture of desperation and demand. "This isn't a theater, Ha-Jin," Zarya whispered, her hands shaking as she opened her medical bag. "I don't have an anesthesiologist. I don't have a blood bank. If I open him up here, he'll go into septic shock." "Then do what you did for me," Ha-Jin commanded, stepping close enough that his shadow fell over the dying man. "Perform a miracle, Zarya. If he dies, a dozen more of my men will follow him into the grave by morning. His life is the only thing holding the peace." Zarya looked at Dae-ho's graying face and then at her own hands. This was the line she had feared crossing. To save this man was to keep the gears of Ha-Jin's war machine turning. It wasn't just medicine anymore, it was maintenance for a monster. But as the lieutenant's breathing hitched into a death rattle, her compulsive altruism, the flaw that had bound her to this world, flared to life. She didn't speak again. She snapped on her gloves, the sound like a gunshot in the silent basement. For the next 3 hours, Zarya worked in the dirt and the dark. She used local lidocaine and sheer willpower to clamp arteries and debride tissue. She worked with a focus so intense that the world outside the pool of light vanished. Ha-Jin stood by her side the entire time, not as a boss, but as her shadow, handing her instruments and holding the light steady when her fingers began to cramp. When the bleeding finally stopped and Dae-ho's pulse stabilized into a weak but rhythmic beat, Zarya slumped against a concrete pillar, her teal scrubs ruined by the grime of the underworld. She looked at Ha-Jin, who was watching her with a terrifyingly profound respect. "You're one of us now," he said softly, reaching out to wipe a smudge of blood from her cheek. "No," Zarya rasped, pulling away. But as she looked at the surgical tools scattered on the warehouse floor, she knew he was right. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was an asset. And in the Mafia, assets were never allowed to leave. The silence of the penthouse had become a language Zarya was beginning to understand, but tonight, it felt like a bated breath. While Ha-Jin was away at a high-level summit, Zarya remained in the East Wing, ostensibly to organize the medical supplies for his ongoing recovery. It was there, tucked inside a discarded ledger in the study, that she found the burner phone. It buzzed with a persistence that felt like a warning, and when the screen lit up, the message she saw stopped her heart. "The shipment moves at 0400. The Iron Fong is ready. My brother is a ghost walking. End him." The sender wasn't a rival. The contact was listed under a name Zarya had seen in family photos, Ji-hoon. Ha-Jin's younger brother, the man who sat at his right hand and toasted to his health just days ago, was the one holding the knife to his back. Zarya sank into the leather chair, the phone feeling like a live coal in her hand. Her mind raced through the implications with clinical speed. If she stayed silent, Ha-Jin, the man who had claimed her, paraded her, and protected her with a terrifying ferocity, would likely be dead by dawn. The cycle of violence would claim the one person who looked at her as if she were the only real thing in a world of shadows. But if she told him, she knew exactly what would happen. Ha-Jin wouldn't call the police, he wouldn't seek justice. He would unleash a massacre. He would hunt his own blood through the streets of the city, and the man she had resuscitated would once again become the monster who had executed an assassin on a hospital table. To save Ha-Jin's life, she had to sign Ji-hoon's death warrant. The sound of the private elevator chimed. Ha-Jin walked into the room, looking weary, the weight of the syndicate pressing visible lines into his forehead. He stopped when he saw her, his gaze immediately softening in a way he only allowed when they were alone. "You're still awake," he said, his voice a low, gravelly caress. He crossed the room, reaching out to touch her shoulder, his fingers lingering near the scar from the poisoned scalpel. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Zarya." She felt the burner phone hidden in the pocket of her scrubs, a leaden weight against her thigh. She looked into his eyes, the dark, intense eyes of a man who had built a world out of loyalty because he was terrified of betrayal. She was a healer, her hands were meant to mend, not to trigger an execution. "Hajin," she started, her voice trembling. Her moral compass was spinning wildly, trapped between her oath to preserve life and her growing, desperate need to protect the man who had made her his world. "If you found out someone you loved was a threat, would you be able to show mercy?" Hajin's expression shifted, the predatory focus returning in an instant. He sensed the shift in the air, the scent of a secret. "In my world, mercy is just another word for suicide," he said, his grip on her shoulder tightening ever so slightly. "Why are you asking me this, Zarya?" The choice was a jagged blade. She could be the nurse who watched a man die, or the woman who helped a monster kill. The betrayal didn't wait for a conversation. Before the words could leave Zarya's lips, the world outside the glass walls erupted in a blinding flash. A thunderous roar shook the penthouse, the reinforced windows spiderwebbing as the first wave of the Iron Fang's assault breached the lower levels. The lights flickered and died, leaving the room bathed in the crimson pulse of the emergency strobes. "Ji-hoon," Zarya gasped, the name finally breaking free as she pulled the burner phone from her pocket. "It's your brother, Hajin. He's the one." Hajin didn't look surprised. He looked hollowed out, a fleeting shadow of grief crossing his features before it was replaced by a cold, obsidian mask of war. "I know," he rasped, drawing a handgun from his waistband in one fluid motion. "I've known for an hour. I just didn't want it to be true." The sound of the private elevator doors being pried open echoed through the dark. Gunfire erupted from the hallway, sharp, rhythmic bursts that signaled the end of the piece. Hajin shoved Zarya behind a marble pillar, his body acting as a human shield. "Stay down. When the breach happens, run for the service tunnel in the east wing. Don't look back. I'm not leaving you." Zarya screamed over the din of shattering glass. A flashbang grenade detonated near the entrance, deafening and disorienting. Through the ringing in her ears, Zarya saw Hajin stumble. He had been shot, a dark stain blossoming on his side, right over the surgical site she had spent weeks agonizing over. He slumped against the desk, his weapon skittering across the floor toward her. Two men in tactical gear emerged from the smoke, their rifles leveled at Hajin's head. They didn't see the nurse. They saw a fallen king. Zarya didn't think. The clinical detachment she used in the trauma bay, the ability to shut out emotion and act on pure survival, took over. Her fingers, which had only ever known the weight of a scalpel or a stethoscope, closed around the cold, heavy steel of the fallen handgun. She didn't know how to aim, but she knew where the heart was. She knew the anatomy of a threat. She rose from the shadows, her teal scrubs a ghost in the red light, and pulled the trigger. The recoil jolted her entire frame, but she didn't stop until the men were down. The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of cordite and copper. Zarya dropped the weapon, her hands shaking violently as she rushed to Hajin's side. She tore open his shirt, her medical instincts clashing with a new, terrifying realization: she hadn't fired that gun to save a patient. She had fired it to save her man. Hajin looked up at her, coughing blood, a jagged, broken smile on his face. He reached up, his bloody fingers cupping her jaw. You were supposed to stay a saint," he whispered. "The saints are all dead, Hajin," Zarya breathed, pressing her hands hard against his wound, her tears blurring her vision. "And I'm not letting you join them." The smoke had cleared, leaving the city in a bruised purple twilight. Below the glass penthouse, the streets were quiet, scrubbed clean of the night's violence with the terrifying efficiency that only Ha-Jin could command. Ji-hoon was gone, the Iron Fawn was a memory, and the syndicate had been pruned until only those loyal to the bone remained. Ha-Jin stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the rising moon. He was dressed in a fresh suit, though he moved with a slight stiffness, a reminder of the lead Zarya had pulled from his body just hours before. Zarya stood in the center of the room, her navy scrub stained with a map of the night's work, blood, grease, and the gray ash of the siege. She felt heavier than she ever had, as if the weight of the handgun she had fired was still dragging at her wrists. "It's done," Ha-Jin said, turning to face her. The cold, predatory light in his eyes had been replaced by something softer, something that looked almost like reverence. "The records at the hospital have been wiped. Your bank account is anonymous. To the world, you were a brave nurse who survived a tragic gang crossfire. You can walk out that door right now, and I will make sure no shadow of my world ever touches you again. You can go back to being a healer, Zarya. You can be the saint again." He took a step toward her, the distance between them feeling like a chasm and a bridge all at once. "Or," he whispered, his voice a low, jagged caress, "you can stay. I have spent my life surrounded by people who fear me or want to be me. You are the only person who has seen me die and forced me to live. I don't just want you by my side, Zarya. I need you there. As my conscience. As my partner. As the only person I trust with my life." He reached out, extending his hand. It was a hand that had ordered deaths and built empires, yet it trembled almost imperceptibly as he waited for her answer. Zarya looked down at her own hands. They were the hands of a nurse, trained to preserve the fragile spark of life at all costs. But they were also the hands that had taken a life to protect the man standing before her. She could feel the ghost of the stethoscope around her neck and the phantom weight of the trigger she had pulled. The line between nurse and asset, between savior and accomplice, had blurred until it vanished entirely. She looked at the door, the exit to the world of sterile hallways and predictable shifts. Then she looked at Ha-Jin, at the man she had resuscitated, hidden in a morgue, and fought for in the dark. She realized that the miracle he spoke of wasn't just that he had survived, it was that he had found her. Slowly, deliberately, Zarya reached out. She placed her blood-stained hand into his, her fingers locking with his in an unbreakable grip. She wasn't a saint anymore, and she wasn't a victim. She was the anchor for a king. "I saved you twice, Ha-Jin," she breathed, her eyes meeting his with a fearless, newfound steel. "I suppose I'll just have to keep doing it."